stood outside the small cafe in the fading winter light, steadying his breathing as his heart pounded with uneasy anticipation. The neon sign flickered overhead, painting the patch of sidewalk in front of the doors with a soft, uneven glow. Several days of hesitant planning had led him to this point, a silent confrontation he could no longer avoid. He could see her through the glass window, bustling behind the counter in a black apron, hair pinned up in a messy arrangement. Her name was Catherine. She looked both familiar and startlingly changed from the memory he had carried with him for 2 long years. In those days, he had never imagined that one day he would be standing outside a humble cafe, building up courage just to cross the threshold and speak to her. He had once been her husband. They had made plans together in a different lifetime, or so it now seemed. Their divorce had been swift, overshadowed by too many fights, too many bruised silences, and an all-consuming obsession of his, a relentless focus on his emerging business. Even after they signed the final papers, he had told himself there was no other choice. Her demands felt insurmountable, his needs too pressing to be postponed. He had walked away convinced that time and success would heal all regrets. That was before he learned that Catherine was pregnant. The rumor reached him quietly and without elaboration, as if no one dared mention it to him directly. At first, he had doubted it. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the timelines didn't align. Perhaps the child belonged to someone else. Rational or not, he had thought these things only to preserve the precarious stability of his life. He had a new relationship, a new professional circle, a new sense of himself, so he tried to quell the pang of longing. Yet an uncomfortable, gnawing sense of responsibility began to eat away at him. Over time, that sense became an inexorable pull he could no longer ignore. His current girlfriend, Annabelle, had noticed the early signs of his restlessness. At first, he tried to dismiss it, telling her he was merely overworked or anxious about a future product launch, but she was perceptive enough to sense a deeper rift in him. He found himself lying awake at night, questions circling like black clouds. Why had Catherine never told him she was expecting? Had she tried to reach him and failed? Or had she simply decided he was unworthy of knowing? Whether or not the child was his, that single, terrifying possibility relentlessly burrowed into him. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be a father, or if he was even capable of it. But the notion that there might be a child in the world with his eyes, his blood, and that he was absent from that child's life, weighed on him more heavily each day. On this grim evening, he finally convinced himself to stop hesitating. He had to see her, or at least confirm what was true. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, then pushed through the cafe door. A warm gust of coffee-scented air enveloped him, a cozy contrast to the chilly wind outside. The interior was dimly lit, with soft bulbs strung along the ceiling. There were a few patrons hunched over mugs, their conversations quiet and contented. Catherine was serving a table by the far wall. His first impression was that she seemed calmer, steadier than the woman he'd last seen during their final arguments. A flicker of sadness rippled through him. The memory of her tear-stained face from so many months ago, her voice torn between heartbreak and exasperation, clashed with this more composed image. But then she glanced toward the door and spotted him. A spark of unmistakable recognition lit her eyes, followed by a wave of confusion and wariness. Without acknowledging him, she turned back to the table. He stood motionless, uncertain if it was better to approach her or to wait. He'd come too far to retreat. Summoning what felt like the remnants of his old confidence, he crossed the cafe. He could see the delicate curve of her abdomen beneath the apron as she wrote something on the order pad. She was pregnant, visibly so. The final confirmation pressed all the air from his lungs. He was too late. The child was real, and Catherine had been carrying on with her life as though he was little more than a piece of distant history. "Catherine," he said softly, standing beside her, "may I talk to you?" Her posture stiffened. He noticed how her hand paused mid-motion, still clutching the pen. She slowly turned, letting the sharp edges of her gaze settle on his face. There was no immediate warmth, no nostalgic softness. "I'm working," she said. The brittle tone matched her hardened expression. "I know," he replied, trying to keep his voice gentle. "I'm sorry for barging in. But can we at least have a moment to speak in private?" One of the patrons shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension. Catherine lifted her chin, as though summoning her own defenses. "I have nothing to say, Andrew," she said. Her utterance of his name, once whispered affectionately, now felt like a distant echo. He inhaled, steadying his resolve. "All right," he said. "Then I'll wait until you have a break, or after your shift. I'm not leaving until we talk." She pressed her lips into a thin line. For a brief moment, he glimpsed a swirl of emotions in her eyes. Hurt, anger, maybe even regret. But she merely nodded tersely and resumed writing. Andrew backed away, seeking out a corner table where he could wait. Sitting there, aware that every minute he lingered risked intensifying her anger, he couldn't help reflecting on the differences between the life he'd led with Catherine and the life he'd constructed afterward. He had been so fixated on climbing the corporate ladder, building networks, meeting the right people, proving his worth. Catherine had grown weary of the fleeting visits, the unanswered messages, the way he treated her pleas for his time as irritations. On the day she declared she wanted a divorce, he had felt an odd sense of relief, as if a burden was being lifted. He could avoid the confrontation, avoid the countless obligations, and dedicate himself fully to his ambitions. Yet now, each memory felt like a self-inflicted bruise. Annabelle had asked him just 2 nights ago if he was in love with Catherine still. He didn't know how to answer. A part of him had never stopped loving her, or at least loving the idea of who she had been. But now he realized how little he'd truly known her during those last months. He wasn't sure what to label his current feelings. Guilt, longing, confusion, some primal sense of responsibility. All he knew was that she was pregnant, and he was desperate to find out if he was the child's father. He waited nearly an hour, watching quietly as Catherine moved from table to table, carrying trays, exchanging polite smiles with patrons. Whenever she passed near his corner, she kept her eyes down. It felt like there was an unspoken boundary slicing through the air, one she had every intention of keeping intact. Eventually, she walked toward him, untying her apron. "I have 10 minutes," she murmured. "We can step outside." He followed her through a side door that opened onto a narrow alleyway. The wind sliced across his cheeks, ruffling his coat. She folded her arms, more for protection than warmth, and gave him a guarded look. In the glow of the overhead street lamp, he saw faint fatigue around her eyes. A pang of concern flashed in him. "First of all, I'm sorry," he began, voice low. "I know it's been a long time. I heard something, and I need to confirm if it's true." She gave a cold huff. "You're talking about this?" She gestured to her belly. "I'm sure you've heard all sorts of things. Why exactly does it matter to you?" Her words stung, though he couldn't blame her for the bitterness. "Because..." He hesitated. He realized he didn't quite know how to phrase it without sounding selfish. "Because if the child is mine, I have to know." She looked away, jaw clenched. It might be. But what difference does it make? You and I ended everything. You made it clear you had more important things to do than be present in our marriage. Why would you care now? He fought the urge to reach for her hand, sensing it would only make her recoil. I never stopped caring, Catherine. I just got lost in everything. I'm sorry for how that must sound. But it's the truth. If this child is mine, I want to help. Help? She repeated it like the word was foreign. Is that your plan? Show up with your money, your new life, and sign a few checks to make yourself feel better? You walked out on me. He flinched. The anger she harbored was justified, and he knew it. I know it's too late to fix what I did back then, but I can't turn away, not after finding out about the baby. Tell me what you need. She shook her head, expression twisting with something more complex than rage. What I need is to live without your pity, Andrew. I've managed all these months without hearing from you. Did you really think I'd be sitting around, helpless, waiting for your sudden concern? I never thought that, he said softly. I know you're strong and capable, but this child, our child. The phrase seemed to take physical shape in the cold air, leaving him momentarily breathless. Look, I'm not asking for forgiveness or a second chance. I'm just asking to be part of his or her life, if that's what you want. If you don't, I won't force anything. But I won't vanish again without trying. She took a shaky breath, as though bracing against a chill deep inside. You don't get to decide that, she said finally, and he heard the heartbreak behind her brittle tone. I don't owe you anything, but yes, it's yours. And no, I haven't been with anyone else since you left. Not that it's any of your business. He felt a strange surge of relief and dread. The child was his. There was no easy path forward, no quick fix. He blinked, pushing past the sudden rush of fear. Okay, he said, voice trembling. I understand, or at least I'm trying to. Let me be there for the baby. Tell me what you need. She closed her eyes a moment, seeming to wrestle with her own turmoil. I'm almost due, she said. I have enough saved up to handle the hospital bills. I've set everything up so I won't have to rely on you or anyone else. Her mouth tensed in something like defiance. I'll figure it out alone. He gently placed a hand on the frigid metal railing near the door, careful not to move closer to her. You don't have to do it alone, he repeated. What if we talk about how we can co-parent or something like that? I promise I won't push, but I can't walk away. Not this time. For a heartbeat, she seemed on the verge of tears. Then she hardened again. Fine. If you want to try, prove it. I'm not stopping you. But don't do this halfway, Andrew, and don't make empty promises, because the moment you back out, that's it. I will never let you come back. He nodded, acknowledging the ultimatum. It was more than he deserved. I promise, he said, wishing he had more eloquence to convey the seriousness of his intent. And thank you for letting me. She nodded abruptly, swallowing whatever she might have said next. I need to get back to work, she muttered. Then, with an uncertain flick of her gaze, she turned and opened the door. Andrew stayed in the alleyway for several seconds, mind awash in 1,000 colliding thoughts. He wanted to chase after her, to fix everything all at once, but he knew that was impossible. So instead, he leaned against the cold wall, exhaling into the lonely hush of the back street, and tried to piece together a plan to earn her trust again. The next few days felt like an unsteady dance. He visited the cafe repeatedly, making sure he never intruded on her actual work. He lingered near the entrance, watching her graceful, efficient movements, trying to catch her eye without making her uncomfortable. On more than one occasion, she spotted him waiting outside and simply strode past him, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. Each time he forced himself to remain patient. He was no stranger to persistence, after all. He had built his career that way. But this was different. There was no business plan, no bottom line. All that mattered was doing the right thing for her and for the child. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from Annabelle, who grew more anxious with each unanswered call. He felt torn. He had told her part of the situation, but not everything. How could he explain that the woman he once loved was carrying his child, and that he was suddenly desperate to be in that child's life? Eventually, he answered one of Annabelle's calls, murmuring an apology and confessing that he needed space to handle personal matters. She, understandably, was upset. He could hear the tension in her voice. He suspected this might well mark the end of their relationship, but he couldn't step away from Catherine's situation now. On a brisk morning, as the day's first rays filtered through the city's grey skyline, Catherine finally stopped in front of him outside the cafe. She wore a thick coat over her apron, her hair cascading around her shoulders in loose waves. She looked exhausted but resolute. "I'm heading to my prenatal appointment," she said, glancing at him with caution. "If you want to come, fine. Let's see if you actually show up." She walked off without waiting. Andrew blinked, then dashed after her. They rode together in tense silence on the bus, the vehicle rattling through narrow streets. Neither made small talk. When they reached the small clinic, Catherine checked in with the nurse while Andrew took in the surroundings. Pastel walls, clean floors, the faint smell of disinfectant. He felt like an intruder in a world he hadn't bothered to learn about before. In the exam room, the doctor greeted them politely, though a trace of curiosity flickered in her eyes when she observed Andrew standing with uncertain posture. Catherine explained the basic situation. He was the father, but they were not together. The doctor nodded professionally, then proceeded with the routine checks and an ultrasound. When the outline of a tiny human form appeared on the screen, Andrew froze. There it was. A fluttering heart, a curve of spine, movements he could barely interpret but which spelled out the irrefutable truth of a life about to begin. He glanced at Catherine, who kept her gaze on the screen, not on him. The doctor pointed out a healthy heartbeat, good measurements, and Catherine's due date, which was only a few weeks away. The next 15 minutes rushed by in a haze of medical details and scheduling notes. Andrew asked only a few questions, still overwhelmed by a sensation that was equal parts awe and terror. After the appointment, Catherine gathered her papers, thanked the doctor, and left the room. She didn't wait for Andrew as she headed down the corridor, though she didn't tell him to leave either. He took that as permission to keep walking alongside her. Outside, the winter had eased into a mild, almost forgiving chill. Catherine looked up at the sky as if searching for answers in the pale morning sun. "So," she said eventually, "that's your baby in there. Feel any different?" He tried to form a coherent response. I don't know how to describe it. I guess I'm humbled. Scared. But I'm glad I got to see that." She nodded, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. "It's not going to be simple," she warned. "I'm scheduled to deliver soon. My mother will be here. She's not exactly your biggest fan, especially after how things ended between us." He winced, recalling his ex-mother-in-law's sharp disapproval at the tail end of their marriage. "I'll be respectful," he said quietly. "Just tell me how I can help." She considered. "I have a small place not far from the cafe. No guest room, no space for you to crash on the couch, and frankly, I'm not inviting you in. But if you want to pick me up after work, or make yourself useful in some way, I won't stop you. Just don't expect me to pretend we're fine. A flicker of gratitude crossed his features. I won't. He hesitated, then gently asked, Catherine, if it's okay, can you message me if you need anything at any time? She sighed, pulling out her phone. Give me your number. I deleted the old one. He recited it, and she tapped it into her device with terse efficiency. All right, she said. There. Don't make me regret having this. He swallowed, trying to keep his tone gentle. I won't. Thank you. She gave a half nod and turned away, setting off down the sidewalk, her coat swaying gently around her. Watching her go, Andrew couldn't help but feel both hope and dread tangling in his chest. It was a precarious place. One false move, and he might lose whatever fragile opening she had granted him. He glanced at the clinic doors behind him, remembering how the faint heartbeat on that screen had made everything else vanish. In that moment, he'd felt a surge of something primal and profound. An instinct to protect, to nurture, to prove himself worthy of being that tiny child's father. He knew the journey would be difficult and that Catherine might never forgive him. But at least now he had the chance to try.